Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be Torath Mosheh versus the Off the Derech movement. Okay, now I know in the first slide I mentioned that what I'm going to be comparing is Torath Mosheh to the Off the Derech movement. I have to be quite honest, it's not exactly a movement per se. The more I kind of looked into it, I kind of got that impression, but sometimes I get the impression that it is to some degree. So the first question when dealing with this, I guess you could say comparison, or not exactly versus in the way that most people think in terms of a fight or argument or debate, but mainly to start off with, I want to define what does it mean to be off the derech. Now, according to Wikipedia, off the derech, or OTD, from the Hebrew word derech, meaning path, is an expression used to describe someone who leaves an Orthodox Jewish community. The term applies to a broad range of ex-Orthodox Jews, including those who leave Hasidic communities, Ultra-Orthodox communities, or Haredi communities, and modern Orthodox communities. At times, individuals who move from a stricter form of Orthodoxy to a more lenient form of Orthodoxy are considered off the derech by the original, more stringent communities. OTD is not a community or a movement, but rather simply describes someone who leaves an Orthodox community to find a different path in life. Such new paths can be other forms of Judaism, other religions, or no religion at all. Okay, so that is the standard definition that I found on Wikipedia for the Off the Derech movement, since it's not exactly movement, but the concept, if we will. And since it's not exactly a community or a movement for the most part, and I stress for the most part, where I would want to stress this discussion is upon the things that you find in red, where it specifically mentioned that someone who leaves an Orthodox Jewish community, and later that such new paths can be other forms of Judaism, other religions, or no religion at all. Now, when dealing with this issue, I think it's important to kind of separate things out a bit, and that's what we're going to do in the preceding parts of this video to discuss this issue. So in order to really deal with this issue, I kind of question whether or not I should try to put faces to what I'm talking about rather than just kind of leaving it open-ended. And I decided that I think faces had to be applied to it, since it seems to be a big thing within the people who become off the derech, or as they call themselves, to do almost like before and afters, meaning that, okay, this is me supposedly on the derech, this is me off the derech, so to speak. And some of those people do it in really dramatic ways. I think you see on the bottom left, there was a guy who became Jewish, was kind of a part of the, I guess you could say, Hasidic community, or one form of it. And then supposedly when he went off the derech, he kind of went in this direction of at one point doing a rap video dressed in women's clothing and things like that. You can further find different people who, if you will, make this supposedly dramatic jump from one thing to the other once they supposedly, again, off the derech. And we don't have to put names to a lot of the people. You can just simply say these are the pictures I found on the internet of them promoting themselves in whatever format they were in and are currently in. So this brings me to a couple of my, what I would call, think about it moments. And when preparing for this particular topic, I just kind of had to think about it and say to myself, okay, there's a couple of questions that would have to be asked here based on the definition of what it means to be off the derech, based upon the type of people who were shown to be supposedly off the derech. And for the most part, people who you could say were promoted as being on the derech at one point, meaning that they were known, and then at some point supposedly being known for being off the derech. And the first question is, what exactly is the derech? Because again, we already described that it's a path or whatever. But, again, the big question would be, okay, well, first of all, the derech that you supposedly were on beforehand, what exactly was it? Was it some one specific thing? And I think that what I find is when people define themselves as off the derech, they usually come from one specific type of like community, meaning that usually it's the either Ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, or modern Orthodox, even Hasidic community. And it seems to be something where they have to kind of make a big deal of being off the derech, which would mean that the derech has to be something that we can define and actually, make a concrete decision about, well, what exactly does it mean to be on it or off it? The next question is, how does one know that said person was even on the derech to begin with? Meaning that, okay, fine, you were born into a certain community, or you converted into a certain community, you dressed the way they dressed, you talk the talk, But what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that you were doing something in a format that is historically, accurate or authentic in any historical way? It's ancient in any way, or is it just something that you were doing because of the fact you were raised in? If you were raised in it, you don't have much of a choice, and if you have, let's say, family members who were part of something very extreme, who's to say you were even on the derech to begin with? So maybe you're off their derech, but not really. Maybe you were never on the real derech to begin with, and we'll get into what that means. The third question is, what kind of community was the person raised in, as I mentioned previously? The next question is, who's to say that said person is leaving the derech for the sake of the truth? Because that's an important element of, if we're talking about this being a so-called religious thing. And I've talked a lot about in previous videos about the difference between Torath Mosheh, is the way I would work it, and religion. So then the next thing would be question 5. At the end of the day, does this person's choice really matter? Meaning that, okay, fine, someone goes off the derech. What does that mean? What does it even really matter in the scope of the universe? Does it matter if someone goes off the derech? Again, that would depend upon what the derech is, even is to begin with. So this is something that's very important to me, because I think one of the things I've noticed when I've heard kind of these off the derech stories, I never hear someone weighing between facts and fiction. Meaning that someone who sat down and said, okay, well, the reason why I walked away from this path, if you will, is because I looked into the Torah and found that the Torah was incorrect here, 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 here. And I also verified that this was something that was common amongst all ancient, authentic, and authoritative, Torath Mosheh communities. And I know that Torath Mosheh is incorrect. I've never seen anyone do it from that angle. I've always seen it done from I don't like the community I'm a part of. I don't like the things I was being forced into by this community, which, can exist. It's not to say that someone following Torath Mosheh is, saints are perfect. I mean, that's not the way things work. I mean, a person always had to try to, do the best they can to correct themselves and be right with things that are ancient, authentic, and authoritative. But at the end of the day, I always noticed that the people who seem to be off the derech, or at least apply that to themselves, that title, never seem to be people who look at things and say facts versus fiction is the reason why I did it. And I even say that when I look at people who especially were somewhat celebrities, meaning that, they were either involved in something that was a part of popular culture, and, they were doing the Jewish thing as a part of that, and then all of a sudden they make this dramatic change in the other direction. And I mean, there's one in particular, I remember seeing a person who was like doing music at one point, and I remember an interview with them back in I think about 2003, 2004, where there were several things when they were on the derech, so to speak, that they were talking about. And I was kind of like, okay, that doesn't sound right. And then later when they became off the derech, it was like, well, that makes sense based upon what they said in 2003. So, and then there's one person in particular I remember being off the derech who went publicly on Facebook writing things, and not just like things like of an anti-Torah or anti-Jewish mindset, because they still want to attach themselves to the so-called Jewish perspective. But again, depends on what you mean by that. But I remember them writing some things that were really, anti-women. And I was kind of like, wait a minute, you're off the derech, and this is the path you've gone. Man, you've gone so far in a weird direction that doesn't even make any sense if this is what you're supposedly about. And I won't get into the details of it, but I remember screenshotting what this person wrote, because it was so far off in terms of anybody who, again, on the derech, off the derech doesn't matter, that it just didn't make any sense to me, which made me think that this person had some other issues going on, irregardless of the derech, so to speak. So this is one of the things I use as a representation. I think there's a Netflix series that I've only today heard about called Ultra-Orthodox, which details this kind of concept of off the derech, especially in the extreme methodology, meaning that I think, I've never seen it, but the character in it supposedly goes through this transformation because of the fact that they grew up or lived in or were being forced to be a part of a very extreme particular culture. Which basically, was one of the catalysts for them supposedly being off the derech or unorthodox, so to speak. And I think that that's something that, again, isn't a matter of it being, okay, well, I'm walking away from this thing because it's the truth. No, this person's walking away from it because the people that they were involved with or the family that they came from was really weird to begin with and had some really strange ideas that aren't ancient, authentic, and authoritative to begin with. And it would make sense that a person would want to escape something like that, especially in that format. So then now let's get to the meat of this. Let's take Torath Mosheh and put it up against the concept of off the derech and what exactly it would mean and what it doesn't mean. So again, in order for us to like detail this, we would have to look and say, okay, well, again, what is Torath Mosheh defined as? Well, of course, as I've mentioned in previous videos, it's all ancient, authoritative, and authentic historical texts, concepts, judicial rulings, practice, and traditions that trace directly back to the singularity of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, as it was transmitted from Hashem to Moshe ben Amram and all of Am Yisrael, and has been preserved by their descendants who are from the most ancient communities of Mizrahi, Temeni, Sephardic, Maghrebi, and Ashkenazi Jews. So what that means is that, again, as we've mentioned in previous videos, is that the claim that's made by the Torah and the people of the Jewish communities of ancient Israel, of all ancient Jewish communities, is that at a certain point, the people of Israel left a place called Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, and they arrived at a place called Mount Sinai. During that time, Moshe ben Amram, who was the leader of that time, and also you could say the king of that time, was told by the Creator of all things to tell the people to wait at a specific location, prepare themselves, and that the Creator of all things would speak to them with Moshe Rabbeinu being among them, meaning that it wasn't like he was up at the top of the mountain making voices and people were like, okay, we heard something talking, but we didn't say Moshe ben Amram, so who's to say he said it or the Creator of all things said it? And what they experienced was a situation was that the Creator of all things caused them to see and hear the words of the Torah that would be giving at that time. And of course, there are some sources that say that the words were written in the air, as if like fire or lightning was writing words in the air, so that when the people have experienced this, the entire nation experienced it, not one individual, which basically is something that hasn't been duplicated or even claimed to be duplicated anywhere in the world, where a person says, okay, well, our cultural origin comes from the Creator of all things giving the entire nation something and speaking to the entire nation and making it apparent to the entire nation, with no dissenting voices from that time period for thousands of years saying that that's something different happened, meaning that you would expect that if the Torah wasn't given in this way, you would have a group that would say, hey, look, my ancestors were at this location, but none of that stuff that these other guys over here claim happened there, because again, you would expect that to happen pretty early. So what this boils down to is not as a religious perspective, and that's why I don't like using the word religious. It's more of a historical perspective, because in history, things either happen or they don't happen. Something either took place in history or didn't happen. There is no real in between. There may be someone who says, okay, well, I don't agree with how a person feels or describes these particular set of events, but the events happen. I just don't agree with this person's interpretations of what it means that it happened. No, if it's historical, it either happened or it didn't. There's a baseball World Series, either happens in history or it doesn't. A war happens or it didn't happen. A ship sailing across the ocean either happened or didn't happen. A meteorite hitting the earth either happened or didn't happen. Something existed as a species or it didn't exist. There's no real in between with that. So the same thing exists with the claim of Torath Mosheh, that it either happened or didn't happen. If it didn't happen, it doesn't make sense for anybody to do anything that's associated with it whatsoever. So that even means if a person says, well, I don't really believe that happened, but I still do like Passover, well, that doesn't make any sense. If the original event that supposedly caused anyone to do Passover didn't happen, it doesn't make sense to do anything about it. It makes sense to just get rid of the whole thing. And also, this is the thing that you find interesting too, that if it didn't happen, it would make more sense for a person to change the historical record about it to what actually did happen, rather than to preserve a text that says something that didn't happen happened. Meaning that, like, let's say you have someone who is, let's say in this example, off the Derech, who still uses a Torah for some reason. It doesn't make sense to use the Torah. It makes sense to abandon the whole thing and basically say, this is wrong for these reasons, and I'm going to change it to what actually did happen instead of what's written here currently. And that's the way that most people would work with history, because history is either something where it happened, that's where it didn't happen that way. If there are questions about what happened, we mention the questions, but we don't like say, okay, well, this myth, supposedly that we know happened, let's study it as if it did happen and treat it as if it did happen, and say like things in our liturgy or in our social lives as if it did. We get rid of it if it didn't happen. So this brings me to the concept of Torath Mosheh versus Off the Derech, because there's a big difference in how this would be worked in a Torath Mosheh mode. That doesn't mean, for example, that if the Torah was given the way it was, that people can't walk off the Derech, from that, meaning that on one side you may have Torath Mosheh and the people of Israel, Am Yisrael, going in one direction, and then someone may say, I don't want to keep that direction. I want to do something different. I want to be like the other nations. I want to be like the other people that around us or not around us. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Even if someone were to witness the Mount Sinai event, they could easily decide, I don't want to be on that path whatsoever, because of the fact that it was given as a free will choice. It wasn't given as like an either take this Torah or be destroyed or burn in, like the lake of fire. No, you can choose not to take it. You can choose to not accept the Torah, and that this happen in any generation. And the flip side of it is that if something's true, it doesn't matter if like the entire nation or a majority of the nation goes off the derech. The creator of all things will still preserve something to make sure that there's always some element of the Torah that exists. Now, this is an extreme example where you have only one person, if you will, keeping Torath Mosheh in this extreme example, but essentially there was a prophet named Eliyahu Navi who at one point, cried out to Hashem saying, I'm the only one out here. Everyone else is like doing Avodah Zarah. And Hashem told him, like, no, that's not true. There's 7,000 people who haven't done it. That Hashem preserved 7,000 people that that Eliyahu Navi didn't know about doing the Torah correctly. And also there was about 100 Nevi'im who were hidden by another Navi to keep them away from the king at the time, who was basically persecuting anyone who was trying to keep Torath Mosheh correctly without Avodah Zarah, and his wife, who was also persecuting people. So the thing is that the creator of all things has made sure to preserve that in every generation there was always someone keeping the Torah correctly. And keeping the Torah correctly doesn't always look the way that people want to modernly place it, for example, in things that, which is usually what off the derech people are looking at. They're looking at something that's modern and then saying, okay, well, this modern thing is not what I want to be a part of. So as an example, one of the things that you really don't find in off the derech people is, for example, them looking throughout the worldwide ancient Jewish communities and saying, okay, this stuff is nonsense. There's some of them that if they knew that those communities existed and looked at how Jews used to dress and used to act before, recent history, some people may not be off the derech at all. But because of the fact that being off the derech means you're not analyzing these kind of things, usually this is something that's completely ignored in terms of their choices and decisions, so to speak. So this brings us back to this whole facts versus fiction concept. Going back to the facts versus fiction concept, will help us understand exactly what the difference would be for someone to, like, let's say, go off the derech just because of the fact that they grew up in a certain community, versus someone who, is like maybe off the derech because they were forced off the derech, so to speak. So what I mean by this is that if you look at like the history of Jews from Middle Eastern countries, North African countries, and also Spanish and Southern European countries, one of the things that happened upon the establishment of the State of Israel modernly was that there were major immigrations that took place, meaning that the government here did a lot of work to try to bring Jewish communities in from all these different locations to try to build up the country. But one of the unfortunate elements of it was that there were some people who worked in the governments at that time and worked on this project to bring in all these Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, in Asian countries, who their concept was, we want the numbers here and we want the people here, but we don't want that Torah stuff that they're talking about here. Meaning that the people who were in charge of trying to bring in Jews from other countries, in many cases, were Jews who were off the derech, so to speak, off the Torah derech, if you will. And not exactly culturally off the derech, meaning that they identified themselves as Jews, but anything dealing with the Torah was something that they did not see as any real value. So they weren't trying to bring Jews here to keep the Torah. They were bringing Jews here in some cases to get them out of the Torah. So that in some cases meant that they were trying to basically convince Jews from some of these different countries to abandon the Torah or to get their children to do it. And that's one of the things that is one of the main reasons that you have Mizrahi Jews and Yemenite Jews, also Ethiopian Jews, and also Sephardic Jews in some cases, who are now in the state of Israel, even in some parts of America, who are modernly secular, if you will. And many of them are not off the derech, not the way that the definition of off the derech usually means, meaning that they don't really separate themselves out from their families. But many of them are off the derech because they went to schools that taught them how to be off the derech, so to speak, but in an Israeli way, meaning that, okay, that Torah stuff is just nonsense. Don't check into it. Don't, look into all the different concepts about it from different communities. Just get off of that. Just leave that behind. That's your grandfather's stuff. Your grandfather didn't know anything. He was primitive. And that's the way things are taught in a lot of places here in Israel, actually, that the Torah is like a primitive thing, where when you really look at the societies that are built up in many parts of the Western world, a lot of that is primitive. Maybe you look at here in Israel, there's a lot of primitive stuff that goes on here that is a part of a modern society, that isn't, that where the Torah is actually more democratic or more responsible than what, you have set up in some of these Western countries. Now, that brings me to, okay, well, when you talk about the off the derech concept, well, what can you do about it? One of the first things I think is that a person has to understand that there's always throughout Jewish history been people who've been off the derech, but in different ways. A classic story. I mentioned a lot about Yemenite Jews on my videos because of the fact that I'm a part of the Yemenite Jewish community. Where there's a rabbi that not too long ago was giving a shiur, and he was telling people, don't think that people walking away from the Torah is only something that happened amongst European Jews or the European Jewish communities or American Jewish communities. He told the story of how about three or so how I think it was three or so generations ago, there was people who left the Torah-based community, the Torath Mosheh communities. One story he gave that his father told him was that in Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, there was this Muslim family who, I forget the name, who was always really nice to the Jewish community, and they never made the Jews bow. It was pretty common practice for Jews to be forced to bow to Muslims whenever they had to walk by them in Yemen. That was just, if you were a Jew, you had to be degraded. That was just a part of the Shia mentality that they had there. But he mentioned that there was this one family that never had the Jewish community do that. So at one point, his father had talked to this guy who was from this family. He was a Muslim guy, and the guy said that about 3 or 4 generations ago, his family was Jewish. But what had happened was that his, I think his great grandfather had gone to the Bet Knesset or the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and either he didn't get the respect that he wanted somehow, or he had some issues somehow. And essentially, he took his 2 sons out of the synagogue, went home and got his wife and his daughters, and then went to the Islamic authorities and basically converted to Islam, became a Muslim, and disappeared from the Jewish community at that point. So what's interesting about that particular story is it's not an isolated incident. It wasn't, especially because the Jewish community's life in Yemen was very hard. The lifestyle in Yemen was very difficult, especially during the times when there was lots of persecution. There was even a story that he was telling at one point about how this one entire Jewish community in Yemen became Muslim over basically on Erev Pesach, meaning right before Pesach started, they basically went out and became Muslims. And now questions arise about why did they do it? Well, if the life was really hard, maybe it was because of how hard things were, and they just were ready to give up. Maybe they were dealing with a lot of extreme measures and situations that caused them to do it. Either way, it doesn't really matter. What is interesting is that you think about those stories, and then you look at the fact that the majority of Jews from Yemen are in Israel right now, and they're not in Yemen. And the current lifestyle in Yemen is a very poor, very difficult one, even for the population that's in charge there. So you think about that and say, okay, well, if those Jews in those generations that walked away had held on a little bit longer, it could have been that their descendants would be here in Israel rather than being over there right now. But because of the fact that they couldn't hold on longer, wouldn't hold on longer, things are what they are. So this is just the perspective I have on looking at it. So in summary, the whole thing about being off the derech, again, as I've mentioned, I usually have found that when I talk to people and they mention this off the derech thing, it always seems to come from a perspective that they're trying to escape something in their community, their family, or whatever, that they're not really looking and saying, okay, well, this isn't true. I've looked into it from all the angles. I've looked at what the Yemenites hold by, the Moroccans hold by, the Mizrahim hold by, the Sephardim hold by, the Ashkenazim hold by, and it's all wrong historically. It couldn't have happened this way. None of this stuff is true. Usually what I've seen is that they're trying to escape something, or there's something about their particular perspective or their outlook or their mindset that's already off the derech to begin with. And this is not putting them down in a bad light, because people make choices, and I'm willing to accept that people make choices, and I'm willing to accept that people have struggles that they either are not prepared for or are not willing to deal with in a certain way. And essentially what it boils down to me in this way. If I was to look at saying, okay, well, I'm going off the derech, for example, the first question I would ask myself is, well, what's the truth? Because if I'm going to go one direction or the other direction, it's not a matter of it being off the derech, because if there's a derech, it seems to imply that the derech is there and it's also true. Because if it isn't true, then you're not off the derech, you're just simply maybe getting on the derech, if that's the case. So I think that that's one of the things I find in the movement, or in the people who I've seen it, that it's always this extreme where they have to kind of show off, or to some degree, I was here, now I'm here, rather than simply saying, well, this is the truth. This is where I'm at, and the truth is found here. And that's why I made this decision, because the truth is here. This is the derech. What I was on wasn't the derech. And then also the issue, like I mentioned before, is, was the person even on the derech to begin with? Or was it just because they had to, because it was family? Could have been that their family was just really weird or extreme. And, their family is the one who pushed them out of the Torah, rather than, for example, them looking and saying, well, let me first investigate what the truth is, and then make my decision based on that. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and thank you for listening. Take care, and bye.